everybody, it must be very, 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 very annoying to not believe in human-caused climate change, because the media is saturated with it, people keep going on about it. I mean, it must really, really be annoying people. And yet again this week, there is another paper from more scientists saying that basically we're going to die. They are, of course, right. I work in healthcare. Mortality remains 100%. I don't care how much of a fighter you are, each and every one of us will die. The beauty is that we get to live a bit, usually before we die. And how we live impacts our immediate surroundings and everything around us. So what is the paper? Because media selectively produces information and puts it out there, generally for a bias based upon its editorial board, generally because the editorial board is controlled by multimillionaires. Most news is fundamentally biased, not to represent truth or 99% of the population, to quote a tired meme at this point, but a true one, but to represent the 0.1% who are actually in charge of most of the finance. And I read the paper, and there'll be a link to the paper. I encourage you to read it. It's not very long. It's more of an editorial where they've cherry-picked some data, and I use the term cherry-picked deliberately because whenever you pick data to support your thesis, you always cherry-pick. However, the data is pretty convincing, as you'll see. If you watch this, of course, if you don't believe in human-caused climate change, that's absolutely fine with me. But at this point in human history, you're very much on the side of the people that believe the Earth was flat. Strangely enough, that's also coming back. People, eh? So there's a bunch of graphs to accompany this article, and each of them is quite important. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about most of them. But before I do that, I'm just going to warn you. I will set Greta on you if you don't pay attention. Okay? There will be a quiz at the end. I'm kidding. And the bottom line here is that it's just a bunch of data, and the data has some importance. The importance of the data is that without data, we are living a faith-based life. We don't know that the sun will rise tomorrow unless we've done some mathematical equations and understand a little bit of astronomy. It's the same with climate, it's the same with weather. But because climate's a chaotic and variable system with large amounts of inputs, we can't accurately forecast it. And there is the wriggle room for the deniers. And you'll see some charts and I'll explain them. But there are parts of the world that's actually cooler now than it was in 1980. Very, very few parts of the world. You'll always get anomalies like that. And just because you live in a particular state, say Oregon, and your weather's been pretty much the same as it always is, except it's probably been wetter in heavier downpours, both in the summer and the winter, you're probably not noticing much at all. Whereas other parts of the world, same country even as America, you'll have noticed a fundamental rise in daytime temperatures and nighttime temperatures during the summer months. You'll have noticed a prolonged spring and a shorter winter. This year, 2019, we had a normal spring in Toronto. The last 2 or 3 years, it's been 3 to 5 weeks early. That has amazing effects. I mean, CO2, plants can grow, no problem. So those are the types of arguments that people are using now against climate change scientists, and it really, really is embarrassing. So pay attention if you don't believe in climate change, or you don't believe in human-caused climate change because of fossil fuels. So where are we in 2019? Well, we have a bunch of data. We have a lot of scientists who study this. Yes, their jobs are dependent on them studying it. However, I would argue that big oil has vast amounts of money into the whole debate and news cycle to promote oil consumption as compared to oil reduction. But there's a whole bunch of facts and figures, and they're worth looking at. So it's worth pointing out that it's 11,258 scientists from 153 countries that actually believe every word of this editorial, and we should take their viewpoint seriously. Even if you disagree with it, to dismiss it really is a strange attitude to take. Whilst I do agree that science does have a moral obligation to give dire news where it's appropriate, I would say that it's interesting that we've had to wait to 2019 for this kind of direct warning about extinction of our species, humanity, from the science community. I'm not quite sure why they've waited so long. The science behind this has been there for quite some time. The trends have been there, and it's been fairly obvious to a lot of us who have science degrees at the baccalaureate and master's level, and certainly the PhD level. When I speak to them at the university, they are a lot more depressed than what their reports are showing, because they're focusing on single issues, generally speaking. It's when you put them all together and you look at what you've got, you go, this is very, very true. There's very little discussion about the ocean and the upper atmosphere effects of carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, sulfides that we're producing in the gigatons from our environmental use of fossil fuels. And people need to have a look at the total effects of all of these greenhouse gas emissions wherever they are, and how that's going to make our society sustainable or unsustainable in the near term. Well, it's no surprise they blame me and you for the current global warming due to human interventions, because we have used most of the fossil fuels and we have been very cavalier about our waste products. And I know it's fashionable to blame India and China. The truth is that it's like you stabbing somebody to death with a knife and then waiting a year and then saying, hey, they're a murderer as well. It doesn't make sense. It is a global issue, and there's definite steps we can take to fix it. Maybe. They think so. I'm not altogether convinced. So like I was saying, they've looked at a bunch of graphs, and we will get to look at those graphs because they are actually profoundly interesting. But they're blaming the general things you may not expect them to blame. Meat consumption, dairy consumption, deforestation, and lifestyle, aeroplane use. It's the number of people on the planet is approaching 8 billion. I was born in 1964. I'm 55. Over my lifespan alone, the amount of product, the amount of stuff we use, and almost all of that stuff is dependent or made from or transported by or both gasoline, has gone through the roof. It's an ever-expanding race to produce and consume more and more stuff to make more and more profit. If Apple doesn't make its profit expectations in 2019, its share price dropped. Now, if Apple made $18 billion and we expected them to make $20 billion and they only made $18 billion, are they really a bad company? Everything has to be more efficient. Everything has to be more consumptive. And if you think about it, that's how cancer operates inside the human body. Now sadly it's not all gloom and doom. They actually found some encouraging things. Globally, birth rates dropping from a high of about 13.5 children for every woman in Quebec in the 1700s. The highest rates now around about 4 to 5 per woman, and that's in very poorer parts of the world. And as they get more economically sustainable, they actually become less and less fertile because they don't breed as much. Education of women and education of girls is critical for this. However, the cynic in me thinks that possibly pollution is making the human race less and less fertile. Certainly, there's been overlooked work done on sperm counts and motility in men, and it's plunging. And that might have more to do with the loss of human breeding potential than conscious decisions. Now, I don't find the fact that the forest loss of the Amazon in Brazil is reduced. It's still increasing, but the amount of increase was reduced for a while. Now it's going back up again. Certainly solar and wind power is taking off all over the spot. There's disinvestment happening all the time to fossil fuels. They've lost about 7 trillion in investment, and carbon pricing is working quite well. However, the bad news continues onwards and onwards. All of the steps humanity's took so far to reduce carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuels. So certainly all the steps humanity's taken so far haven't even capped the amount we're producing. We're still producing more and more each year. There was a bit of a slowdown a few years ago, but that slowdown has ended and we're taking off again. And people are breathing in a lot of pollution and getting cancer and COPD and asthma all across the world now. It's not just localized to the poorer countries. It's definitely true in Toronto. And nobody's making the link. Nobody's saying, I get my car, I drive my kids to school, which is half a kilometre, half a mile, and my kids all have inhalers. And when I grew up, nobody had an inhaler. Nobody's clicking into it. We are very much the frogs in the pot boiling. Currently there's almost nowhere on the planet Earth that's uninhabitable for the human species, though pretty much everywhere now requires external inputs to thrive, and even most places survive. But the end point of this with feedback mechanisms and loops is if we continue to keep doing what we're doing, large parts of the Earth, according to them, will be uninhabitable. A lot of other people claim that the entirety of the planet Earth will be uninhabitable for humanity in a time period. Some people say 2 years, some people say 50 years, some people say 20 years, some people say 100 years, some people say 200 years. It's actually irrelevant if you think about it. We are killing our own planet, we're destroying our own home. It doesn't really matter about the time scale. Any intelligent species would go, perhaps we should stop doing that. So I'm sure the fossil fuel industry would claim this is unfair. They're only producing a product, and what people do with it is not really anything to do with them. And therein lies the problem that we do have as a human species, is we don't hold the multinational corporations accountable ethically, morally, or even financially or legally in most aspects, and they are actually responsible. The truth of it is that most of the pollution, most of the global warming effects that we're seeing are caused by fossil fuel burning and extraction. And on top of that, we're now seeing secondary effects from plastic pollution in our oceans and our everything. I read a stat recently that said that all sea salt now contains plastic particles. So, I mean, there is a limit to what we can waste in a sealed environment and not destroy that environment. Now, full disclosure, I personally think it's hopeless. I think it's hopeless. I think society's going to collapse. I think billions of people will die. Possibly everybody will die, and I think it will be in a time period between the next 5 to 25 years. I see no way out of that. However, the Alliance of Scientists come up with 6 critical areas to actually fix the problem, and I'm just going to very quickly go over them, and then we'll get into the graphs. No surprise, get rid of fossil fuel use and use low carbon renewables, and they say which ones they are, and use cleaner sources for energy. No doubt fossil fuels have been a massive bonus for humanity's technological drive, but we're now at the point where we have to actually remove our waste products and deal with our waste products, which we tend not to do very often as a species. Short-lived climate pollutants are actually a big problem. Carbon soot, hydrocarbons, fluorocarbons, all of that stuff, methane. No surprise, millions of lives and increasing crop yields due to reduced air pollution. If we could do this, this would be absolutely spiffy, wouldn't it? Now, I look at this as a secondary effect. If we actually deal with the actual problems, which is too many people, too much resource use, too much fossil fuel use, most of these things would do okay, because part of the solution would be to actually prevent sprawl and waste from being free for producers and for consumers. But again, I'm not altogether sure if we're going to get there. For many reasons you should go vegan. I've been vegan about 9 years, maybe 10 years now, and vegetarian since 2001. And I'm doing okay, and I'm actually overweight because of my bread dependency. But yeah, you'll see things about tofu destroying the Amazon, which is absolute nonsense. It's all to do with eating meat and how much meat people are eating. It's not healthy for us, it's not healthy for the planet, and it sure as heck ain't healthy for the animals. So just stop eating meat. It's very easy to say carbon-free economy, but very hard to do. And yeah, the better we can do that, the better it will be. But I do agree that GDP needs to be removed as an indicator of growth. There's no particular reason, for example, in Toronto, why the GDP has to keep growing and growing and growing. We should be actually stabilizing and dropping it. People can be happier if they're not always pursuing more dollars per hour. And I do think we've got to the point where our entire lives are now dependent on utter nonsense of trying to increase the GDP. You know, get all those people building homes on agricultural land and get them to renovate homes that are existing. There's lots of things we could do. It's all going to require massive government intervention on a global scale. So I didn't capture population because it's at the bottom of the page. And the top of the page, and I couldn't be bothered, I'm a bit lazy. Also a problem humanity has. But what they're actually advocating is to put programs in place to reduce population, to stabilise it and hopefully, quote, to reduce it. I mean, that's absolutely vital. We need a population of about 500 million to 1.5 billion people on the planet to actually be able to be sustainable on this planet without massive engineering projects in the solar system. And we're a long way from that. So one of the advocations they have is to educate girls. That's always a good one, and that's being done globally in most countries, and that's great. But you've got to remember about colonialism, you've got to remember about cultural imperialism, and other religions have different traditions, and it's not exactly up to us to tell them that they're at fault in their own countries. We certainly don't like it here. To finish up, they talk about suing, ecocide lawsuits and all the different things that are being done. So it's a very dismal picture with, again, a lot of hope in it. And Guy McPherson calls this hopium. which is like the opium of the extinction. The extinction is going to happen. Most people who've studied it know that. So what they do is they focus on little pieces that they can do to be happy. And that's kind of what I'm doing. But I must admit, living a greener life, though I'm still a massive carbon producer because of who I am and where I live and what I do, is actually a more sustainable life. You know, those of us who've got the money can buy products that are carbon neutral or even carbon capture. Most people aren't in that position. Most people are struggling very, very hard all across the planet and including in the richer countries. But yeah, let's get into the graphs. So I'm actually going to do a follow-up video where I'm going to go into their graphs in huge detail because they have multiple graphs. These are from The Guardian, and they actually are looking at a few selective ones, and they added colour to them. The actual report has black and white, which is kind of fun. So yeah, population's rising, so resource use is rising. Air transport is ludicrous, and that's really bad for the upper atmosphere. And meat production is rising, which is very bad for soil, forests, natural ecosystems, and carbon dioxide, and human health, and the animals, which I think we all kind of know. So the other one is the encouraging signs, and obviously when you have graphs on short scale you can really make things look good. Remember the hockey stick graph? It was actually fairly accurate, but just by altering the baseline you can alter things quite a bit. So like I said, carbon pricing is coming in and it's helpful. I don't think it's anywhere near what it should be, and it's not going to work that well, and it has to be absolutely guaranteed not to take money from the poor and the middle class, and that's going to be the problem. Consumption has to drop, and this is a form of taxation to prevent mindless consumption, which we have everywhere. And I'm considering diverting my money out of fossil fuels. It's actually very, very hard to do that and also save for retirement. Bear that in mind. Again, fertility, that's a factor of pollution in my opinion, and lifestyle. The endless drive for GDP is not helpful. People haven't got the time, the energy or the money to actually reproduce themselves, which in the long run is probably a good thing, but who knows. So then they followed this up with 6 of the quick graphs. Carbon dioxide is continuing to rise. Where's it coming from? It isn't coming from volcanoes, it's not being imported by aliens, it's coming because we're burning fossil fuels. I'm still confused as to why people don't believe that. Methane, similar. This is meat, and this is also probably permafrost melting, which is one of the reasons I'm very much an eco-doomer. Temperature changes on the surface is not a great indicator, but it is rising rapidly. And sea level change is rising rapidly as well. A few millimeters doesn't sound a lot, but it can make a huge difference locally in terms of flooding. The extreme weather events. Now, obviously, as I keep saying, you have to be completely out of your mind not to know that the climate is having major issues, because there's been a doubling of extreme events. Now, I do have to point out that there's many more people now, and therefore they're more likely to experience extreme events. But this is actually counting hurricanes, this is counting forest fires, this is counting all of that stuff. But it is definitively rised. The amount of ice in the Greenland and the Arctic and the Antarctic by volume has dropped and is dropping dramatically. Well, there you have it. I hope you got something from this video. I'm not going to tell you that the solutions are easy. I'm not going to tell you the solutions are individual, but I will tell you it feels good to try to help mitigate what is going on to some degree. From a prepping point of view, to ignore this kind of data is absolutely outrageous. What sort of a person are you? What sort of a prepper are you if you take valid scientific data and dismiss it as a conspiracy of people to get research grants, or even worse, the Agenda 21? I keep telling you people, if Agenda 21 was real, we'd all be dead now. The governments have absolute control over the population as it is. If they wished to kill, they can, and they could do it very, very effectively. I'm not quite sure why you all think it has to be secret. I know some of you in the States think it's because we've got guns and we'd rise up and fix the issue. Well, you wouldn't, and you'd all die. But the other issue with this is, where do you take this sort of an information? It can be very, very depressing. And it is, but try and remember that you're actually going to die anyway. The whole focus of your life is 2 parts. One, to have children or help other people's children to continue the species. That's the prime directive of all life, and we are animals. The second directive is to do good and feel good in the life that you have prior to death. I think a lot of people out there, because they're trapped with the GDP economy, the consumptive capitalism that's a malignancy on the planet and for us, are actually having a hard time being happy, being content, feeling good about their daily action. And trying to tweak things a little bit helps. Like when I teach global health, I always point out that people are using single-use coffee cups and how many thousands of dollars, about 3,000 to 4,000 Canadian, they spend a year on buying coffee that's harvested by children in bad conditions for peanuts, that's wrecking the economy and the soil of mostly African nations. For what? You can go 12, 13 hours without a cup of coffee. You can buy expensive coffee and not use it as much. Little actions make a big difference. It's the same with plastic water bottles. What sort of nut job spends $2 Canadian buying a bottle of water, 500 mils, less than a pint of water, when they're thirsty, when there's taps and refillable water available? So have a look at how you're living your life. Is it a life that is sustainable for your children and your grandchildren's children? Is it a life that is making you fundamentally content and happy with your existence? If not, make a few little changes, not major ones, but a little one. Make a few changes. Look around you. What could I stop consuming today that would reduce carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere and would increase my bank account so I can buy things that are decent for me and for the planet? So there you go. Hope you enjoyed this. The lecture one will be a little bit drier, but I do want to go through their graphs. They have like 20 plus graphs, and I think each one really deserves a good hard dive. Toodles, and I hope you enjoyed that. This is a Bad Terry production, 2019.